Great. Gentleman's time has expired. The Chair recognizes the gentlelady from South Dakota, Ms. Herseth Sandlin.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman, and thank you for hosting this hearing. And I want to echo the sentiments of my colleague, Mr. Inslee, Doctor, for you being here and the work that you have done to address the serious issue of global climate change. I represent the state of South Dakota and the Great Plains, and so I'm very interested today in hearing more from your testimony and perhaps posing some questions as it relates to the risk of climate change globally in agricultural sectors, but also the opportunities that provides for rural parts of the world, particularly the economic advantages of renewable energies in all forms, as well as the issue that we are going to be grappling with that actually got some attention here just a couple of days as it relates to the offsets that were purchased by the House of Representatives, and one of the projects being in the agricultural sector, actually perhaps two of them, and how we go about measuring and having standardized measurements for the carbon that can be stored in the soil based on farming types, grazing practices, farming practices, and the importance of making sure we get that right, because there are already farmers and ranchers that are trading on the Chicago Climate Exchange, and I have significant worries about how that's currently structured, what the value of those offsets will be in the future, and the monitoring that's required. So thank you very much for being here today. Look forward to your testimony.
Chair recognizes the gentlelady from South Dakota, Ms. Herseth Sandlin, for 10 minutes.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Again, Doctor, thank you for your testimony. And if we could spend a few minutes on agriculture. If you could respond to this proposition. I have a constituent in the western part of South Dakota who believes quite strongly that the agricultural sector, not just in the United States, but across the world, but in the United States in particular, is essential in transitioning from where we are now to deploying new technologies, particularly in the coal-fired plant facilities for electricity generation, because he feels that there is potential within the agricultural sector to work as a carbon sink so that the greenhouse gas emissions don't get any worse from now until we get these new technologies online. Would you respond to that proposition? Do you agree, disagree? And if you agree, how imperative is it that agriculture be participating in a cap-and-trade system if indeed that's the direction that we choose to go in the United States, but also perhaps integrating agriculture into the European cap-and-trade system?
Conceptually, ma'am, I think, yes, agriculture should be a part of any such scheme that involves mitigation of greenhouse gas emissions. And I would combine with this forestry options as well, because anything that grows by way of biomass has the potential to fix carbon dioxide. And I think it should be part of an accounting system.
Well, thank you so much for your response, because you touched on a couple of other issues I'd like to explore. And given the realities that you've illuminated through the scientific analysis that Mr. Inslee was exploring with you as well, the recognition that given the projections and the pressure and the demand by many for industries to adapt, I also think it's very important that non-governmental organizations, that environmental organizations in particular, also take a step back and reassess the positions that they have advocated in the past in light of the imperative of acting to reduce greenhouse gas emissions. So when we passed the energy bill last December, unfortunately at the last minute, a change was made to the definition of biomass as it related to the participation in the renewable fuel standard to prohibit the use of biomass off federal lands for qualifying toward meeting the targets in the renewable fuel standard. Biomass in a national forest that, if it's left to rot, emits methane into the atmosphere, biomass that, if burned, emits carbon into the atmosphere. And I understand that we have to make sure that we're not turning our national forests into fuel farms. No one wants that. But within the existing forest planning process, I think we can address these issues. And so when you mentioned forestry practices, I think that not only in the discussion of deforestation and the problems associated with that, and finding the right balance between the need for increased yields and crop production so that we have food security and also its role in energy security, I do appreciate your reference to biomass, and I would just I'll bring to my colleagues' attention on the committee that I am introducing a bill to fix the definition. I think it needs a fix in biomass to allow the use of biomass off federal lands in the United States to participate in the renewable fuel standard. It was an egregious change at the last minute. We had a consensus on that definition, and I would like your ideas on whether or not you think, from your experience, biomass, whether it's off federal lands in the U.S., or maybe you could elaborate when you referenced biomass being an important part of evaluating the forestry options as it relates to agriculture. And then also the design of new crops. We have a lot of organizations across the world that are opposed to genetically modified organisms. Now, as it relates to food scares in other parts of the world, I've been eating GMOs for over 10 years. You know, a lot of us have here in the United States. But when we're talking about biofuels production, and we're talking about drought-resistant crops to be grown in different parts of the developing world as well, I think that that's another area where people have to take a step back and say, what is the reality of today? And do we need to reassess as it relates to the priorities of what we're dealing with environmentally, as well as the energy security issues and food security issues? So if you could maybe elaborate just a little bit more on the reference to biomass and forestry practices and the issue of genetically modified organisms as it relates to the crop varieties, that even if there continues to be resistance on the food front, that we have to address the issue of crop varieties, whether they're GMOs, drought-resistant, what have you, to address the issue of water resources and increasing crop yields in light of the climate change challenges we face.
I would agree with you on this approach, ma'am, because I really think we need to look at new scenarios of how biomass can be part of the solution, not only in terms of reducing emissions of greenhouse gases, but providing food as well as fuel.
Thank you very much for your testimony, and you may know this already, but I think I've mentioned it to the chairman as well and for Mr. Hall. There is the technology exists currently in Upton, Wyoming, right across the border from South Dakota, where they've been using slash piles off the national forest in the Black Hills and off private lands as well to convert woody biomass into cellulosic ethanol, and they are looking to expand not only at that plant but elsewhere throughout the region. And I'm sure you can imagine their response when the biomass definition in the energy bill would not allow them to qualify toward the RFS when they couldn't use the slash piles off the national forest. And here they are, ready to move us forward within the next, year or two toward commercial development of cellulosic ethanol. And yet they now face some barriers to their potential growth. And sharing that obviously moving that technology to benefit the economic situation here and the marketplace overall. So thank you very much for your testimony and your insights.
The time of the chairman has expired. Let me recognize the gentlelady from South Dakota for a second round for 5 minutes.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. And the renewable electricity standard certainly would be important, not only here but across the world, in developing wind and solar technologies, just as you were saying, in terms of wasteland or other less fertile land where you could grow maybe inferior crops for food, you could grow certain crops for fuel, renewable fuels production. Similarly, we have great swaths of land in the Great Plains with wind resources in the American Southwest, and then, of course, the biomass in the Southeast. And so I'm pleased that the chairman probed sort of that topic and the importance, too, of the infrastructure necessary with the electricity grid, because we know what we did in the energy bill helped us on the transportation fuel side and its contribution to greenhouse gases. But we also know on the electricity side that that contribution is even greater, and hope that those new energy sources would be deployed to developing countries or those that are beginning to match the United States in terms of energy consumption. You had mentioned previously in response to Mr. Hall's questions the importance of the market signals of a price on carbon. And I know I'm sort of probing here with you some policy versus the scientific analysis that you've done. But in all of your discussions with those around the world and how we best send the market signal without doing damage to GDP in the short term or the long term, looking at, again, the opportunity for economic growth, in light of your example of Germany and how we've lost market share here in the U.S. in renewable technologies to Japan and Germany and other countries. Do you have a sense, is there a consensus that is emerging as it relates to cap and trade and how you allocate the allowances versus a carbon tax? At least at this stage of the discussion here in the United States, my preference would probably be cap and trade, and that based on an auction of the allowances, you could generate a revenue stream to help soften the economic blow to lower income Americans, put that money toward R&D as well and infrastructure development. And I also think that given the complexities of the measures, whether it be in agriculture or other sectors, it seems to me you can, over time, perhaps more easily develop a global market and allow the market to help us versus a carbon tax that may be different in different countries and the political challenges that we face. And I don't know if a carbon tax as it relates to imports, exports, and how that frustrates international trade. Do you have any thoughts based on your conversations with policymakers in other parts of the world as to whether or not any consensus is emerging in terms of a preferred approach?
Ma'am, I think we would really need a combination of approaches. One would be essentially through cap and trade types of measures. You would also need some regulation. I mean, whether one looks at appliances or automobiles, setting certain standards and benchmarks, even in the case of buildings, would make an enormous difference, because in the building sector, we do consume a lot of energy, and much of that can be reduced through the right kinds of technologies and know-how built into the design of buildings. So I think we need a package and a mix of measures, and the debate should really look at how the public is willing to accept a mix of these, and how one might be able to bring about a transition without too much of hardship to any section of society.
Thank you very much. Thank you, Mr. Chairman.
Great. Gentlelady's time has expired. The chair recognizes